Hi, I'm Brick Road, and I wrote a book. Usually, when I make videos on YouTube and I take a hiatus for whatever reason, I don't like make a video about my return after my absence. I tend to not like videos like that, but this time I felt like some explanation might be in order. What have I been doing the past couple of months, if not updating the YouTube video game Let's Play content series that you all have been watching? So if you're just looking for the news, you can just like watch the first couple minutes of this video and then you'll be completely caught up to speed. And then after that, I'm just going to ramble stream of consciousness and unpack a bunch of stuff for the next however many long hours I play Final Fantasy IV today for. So, question number one, Brick Road, did you write a book? I did write a book. Number two, can I read it? I don't know. Maybe someday. I don't know how publishing works. It's just a first draft. We're doing like proofreading and revisions and stuff. I have no idea how any of that part of the process works, or if anybody will ever be able to read it at any point down the line. If so, of course, I'll announce it here, and you'll be able to get all of that information at some point long down the road. Question three, do you want to read this book? I don't know. It's a fantasy romance story that is probably a little too spicy to even summarize on my YouTube channel, which I like to keep like a hard PG is where I like things to land, more or less usually. Is this just going to auto battle, or do I actually have to put in commands here? Question four, like, what else have you been doing all this time? Well, I got into a weird headspace end of last year where I was real burned out on making video game content, and I was like, I need something new. So I got together with some friends, and we put together a Weird Al Yankovic podcast, the first 2 episodes of which are up at the time of this recording. That's going to go up every Saturday on this channel until we've run out of Weird Al Yankovic albums to talk about. I needed something different. This was a great chance to kind of get out of my comfort zone a little bit and to collaborate with some great people on another project. So that content is all coming once a week, every Saturday until we're out of albums. So that's the news. That's where I've been. Next question would be, when are the regular updates coming back for Let's Plays? And that answer to that question is the day after this video goes live, I will be starting the next Let's Play series, and then from there we're going to get back and we're going to finish like Outer Wilds and like Ultima and stuff and whatever other garbage games I was playing. That's it. That's the update. That's where I've been. That's what I've been doing. If that's all you needed to see and hear today, I hope that I was able to assuage your curiosity, and I'm just going to just ramble now for a very long time. I didn't pick this game at random. Oh, I guess, question 5. Why are you playing Final Fantasy IV today? This is a test recording. I'm doing a test recording. I got a Steam Deck set up to record Steam games from. My PC game, my gaming PC getting a little long in the tooth. Recording from it can be a chore sometimes. I know that there were problems with my Bloodstained series that I did a little while ago. And there are also some problems with my Outer Wilds series that I'm currently recording. I did record that on the PS5, but some of the footage I had to go back and get on the PC, and that is not... The problem is I built this PC a long time ago, and it's trying to run games and record using OBS in the games, and it's not great. So I got a Steam Deck to try to stave off having to build a gaming PC for another couple years. Very generous viewer donated it to me, and I got it all set up, and I'm playing it now, and this is the game that I chose to do my test recording. That's why I'm playing Final Fantasy IV today. But the reason I chose Final Fantasy IV, this is the Pixel remaster, by the way, if you weren't familiar with how the game looks in the Pixel remaster. Pixel is a cool word, and I promise I will use it again at some point. But Final Fantasy IV was like the point in my life. This would have been 1991, so I'm like 9 years old, right? Is there auto run in this game? I gotta turn it on, don't I? I got a very clicky controller, too, I'm sorry to say. There is no auto run, is there? Alright, no auto run. Cool, we'll just hold the button down like a madman as we get to work. Final Fantasy IV, which I knew at the time as Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, was like, that was the moment in my life when I knew I was going to be like a lifelong fan of fantasy literature. Like, I had experienced some fantasy stuff before then, like I'd seen the movie Willow, which is excellent, one of my favorites. I'd seen the Rankin Bass animated film The Hobbit. That's an excellent version of that. In terms of video games, I had played Final Fantasy 1. I probably played like Dragon Warrior and Legend of Zelda, stuff like that. But Final Fantasy 2, which is to say Final Fantasy 4, was like, oh, I'm going to be a fan of like fantasy fiction my whole life. Like, this is my genre. This is where I came into it. This game captured my imagination in a way that no like other video game had to that point. I would also probably read through the Chronicles of Narnia by that point in terms of actual books. I hadn't actually read like Lord of the Rings or anything. I was like 10 years old, barely. So yeah, Final Fantasy IV captured my imagination. I was going to be a lifelong fan. Swords and sorcery fantasy, that's my jam. I got into D&D after that. I played every Final Fantasy I could get my hands on. I read a lot of really bad fantasy throughout middle and high school. A lot of D&D books, the Dragonlance series, some Ravenloft stuff. And so yeah, just fantasy is my genre and always has been, as opposed to, I suppose as opposed to like sci-fi or superheroes are the other two big options, really. Like you have to pick one and stay in your lane, and you're never ever allowed to see another one ever again. But I knew playing Final Fantasy IV that I wanted to write fantasy, and I was 9 or 10 years old. And so like I just wrote stories in the way that this game tells the story, which is like in a sequence of dialogue boxes and then like little stage directions, like Kain walks through the door with Cecil, and then like a line across the page to indicate a fade to black, and then like the text crawl. So all of this, like I wrote those for years, all through high school. Like that was my creative outlet. I'd be in class, writing just on loose leaf paper and have big folders filled with these stories. And I've been trying to write a fantasy book, like a novel, probably since middle school, and I've never actually gotten far in that process. So that's what I'm going to be rambling about today, is that process. So I hope you enjoy, if you haven't clicked off the video by now, just the explanation of this like long, weird journey I've been on that finally last week culminated in me completing a book. It's not a full story, and I'm not going to give you a plot summary because, first of all, I don't want to give anything away because it's a first draft. That would be a bad idea. But also, I don't want to. I am afraid the story is too spicy for YouTube. Not for my YouTube, I should say. I could put the story summary on my Salute the Flump D&D channel and it'd be fine. But yeah, I've been trying to write a fantasy story for a long time, and what usually happens like a cycle, right? So since 2014 or so, 2014 or 2015, I'd have to double check. But I started playing D&D on the internet with some dudes. I have a second YouTube channel called Salute the Flump. I'll put a link down in the doobly-doo if you haven't seen it. It's where we archive all of our footage from all of our sessions, right? Do I need to do anything here? No, I can just go. We don't need to do anything in town. We're just going to go. I'm not even going to save. It auto-saves in this version of the game. I'm spoiled. So that's been like my main creative writing outlet for the past 6, 7, 8 years now, is D&D. I have a good idea for like a fantasy story or like an interesting character or like a encounter with monsters or something, and I put it into the D&D campaigns. So I have a big folder on my laptop just filled with ideas for, oh, you can walk diagonal in the Pixel remasters, I forgot. I just have a folder on my laptop desktop labeled Flump 5, which is the current campaign we're running. We're about to wrap it up and move on to an interlude campaign, and then after that, we're going to go into Flump 6. And it's just filled. It's just text files with random names and just jots downs of ideas. And like once in a while, I'm like, whenever I need to design an encounter, an adventure, a storyline for D&D, I go into that folder and I look for one that looks interesting. Like, oh, I forgot I had this idea. I get my ideas. I steal a lot of ideas from a lot of places. That is 90% of the work when you're running a long-form D&D campaign is steal someone else's... Why do work yourself when the work's already done for you? You know, like, somebody else already made a cool Monster King, and you had to, like, go fight the monster. Like, you don't have to write a Monster King story. That's already written. Just steal that guy's, and then put it in your own campaign. And now it's like you wrote it, but you didn't because you're a filthy thief and plagiarist. That's my life. That's what I do every single Sunday. So I have this folder filled with these ideas. Like, what if I steal this idea, but like I change this one or two things? I get a lot of ideas from dreams. That's not a surprise because I consume a lot of fantasy, literature, movies, TV shows, books, video games, and like all sleep is funky neurons in your brain firing at random while your eyeballs are moving around and you're unconscious. Like that's all dreams are. So you get images and events and pictures, and sometimes you wake up and you remember them. You're like, oh, I can like put all that together into an encounter for D&D. Like that's something I can do. So what usually happens is I'll have this idea and it's too stupid. It's a ridiculous, it doesn't make sense, and so take that, the thing, there's the random neuron firing, bouncing around all the other fantasy literature that I've been absorbing. Take that and sit down and like as an exercise, like a writing exercise, just try to figure out, can this be made not stupid? Like what aspects of this have to be changed or dropped? Is there anything else I can add? And a lot of times it's in the form of a character, and sometimes it's in the form of just an event or a monster encounter. I had a D&D encounter once where I just had this very vivid idea of this encounter inside this giant clock. So the clock face is on the floor, and like gears and stuff are moving around, and at first it wasn't anything worthwhile, and I had to actually sit down and really work at it to be like, okay, can I actually get this to work? And then it didn't. I ran the encounter and it was garbage. My players hated it. But that's how it goes sometimes. And sometimes I get ideas into my head for a D&D campaign that I plan on using, but then don't get used for whatever reason. And that's what happened with... Oh, I want to ignore the warnings. Yes, and fight the boss. That's what happened with this character for this book that I just finished writing. I had an idea for this character. It wasn't an original idea. I've seen the idea done a bunch of other ways in a lot of other places. And I'm like, I think I have like a fresh spin on this idea. And my intention was years ago for Flumph 3 was called Flumph of the Wild. This was like a wilderness campaign where everybody had to play, all the players had to play monsters. You weren't allowed to roll up a human, an elf, or a dwarf. You had to roll up like a goblin or an orc or something. And I had this idea, like I've got this character concept. I just got cold misted. I wasn't paying attention. And I'm like, okay, well, so what I'm going to do is introduce this character into the game as what's called a DMPC. If you've played a lot of D&D and you just rolled your eyes right there, I'll explain. A DMPC usually is what happens when your DM would rather be playing Dungeons & Dragons than running the game. So they like roll up their own character to go on the adventure with the heroes, and there's like a million reasons to not do this. There's like it can be a very, very lousy idea. But in this campaign, the conceit was, like, there's no magic spells in the world. There's magic, but you can't learn to cast magic spells. You couldn't be a wizard or a cleric. I just disallowed magic-using classes at character creation. And in my notes, I knew that there was going to be a magic system later that the players could interact with to craft their own spells and learn them, regardless of what class they had picked. Like, by the end of the game, we had our monk in the game had the shield spell, which there's good reasons. The monk in D&D 5th edition should not be allowed to cast the shield spell. Ours could because of the spellcraft system. But as a result of this spellcraft system, I foresaw the problem of, well, this party's going to have difficulty healing itself and regenerating hit points. So I'm like, okay, I know, the players don't know yet, but I know that there's going to be this spellcraft system, and one of them's going to craft, like, cure wounds or something. And that's, like, a process they could learn to do in the game. And I'm like, but I'm going to have a DMPC whose job it is to... Like, she's already been through this process, so she'll come into the party already having the ability to cast, like, cure wounds. And so that was the idea, like, introduce this character into the game. And the character is a druid. She was a satyr. And she had a curse, so she couldn't wear clothes. That's the curse. This I thought it was like a silly, like, funny idea that was going to solve some problems that DMPCs sometimes have. So she's a druid, and she can't wear anything. She can't wear armor or clothes or anything. So she's going to endear herself to the party right away. They want to take care of her and bring her along. But in scenes where, like, there's social interactions with other characters, like, I've got a good in-universe reason to pull this druid out. Like, she doesn't want to go into town because she's not wearing anything, and that's embarrassing. But I also, in 5th edition D&D, had a really good mechanic. Like, because druids in 5th edition at very low levels can wild shape into monsters, or into animals, rather. So my thought is, like, okay, so when they're going into social scenes, when they're going into towns, or they're talking with other NPCs, like, she can turn into a bird and, like, pretend to be one of the other characters' familiars, right? This solves so many problems with DMPCs, especially for me, because I hate when I'm running a game having a scene where, like, 2 NPCs have to interact and talk to each other, because then I'm just talking to myself. So I didn't want to have this character, this healer character, who's really, her only job is to be with the party in dungeons and to cast healing magic when they're, like, in combat and stuff. And I have a perfect excuse and perfect mechanic to completely take her out of all social scenes. And then I've also got, like, a fun story hook. Like, you got this curse that the players are going to want to, like, figure out how to remove, but it's also, like, really low stakes. Like, it's nothing's bad's gonna happen if they don't engage with the character, like, if they don't follow through on this curse. It just seemed like it was gonna fix a lot of problems at once. Then we had Session 0. Session 0 is a session you do at the beginning of a D&D campaign, just to kind of set the tone for the whole campaign. Usually I'll do this with character creation, lay out the rules for the campaign, what all's allowed, what's not allowed. Everybody rolls up their characters. And so what happened was we did our Session 0, and I had a plan to introduce this druid character 3 or 4 sessions into the game before they go into, like, their first dungeon and was going to need some healing. And they rolled up this party that I looked at their character sheets, and I'm like, they don't need this druid. First of all, mechanically, like, this party, these guys are pretty tough. Like, they're going to be okay. And also, I looked at it, like, the characters that they rolled up, like, their personalities, like, are not going to gel with this character concept I had in mind for the DMPC. So, scrap the character, and she went back into the big pile of unused D&D ideas to be pulled up at a later date. That is a very, very long document now. And that's the great thing about D&D, is if you run D&D for a long time like I do, you don't ever, like, no idea, no concept is ever thrown away. Like, if I don't use it at the table, like, it goes back in the folder. I still have it. So I have it in my back pocket, right? And I'm like, if I have a campaign in the future, and I have a place to put, like, a Feywild campaign would be a good spot for this druid character. Like, so I have her in case I need her. I've got 1,000 characters like that. Sometimes I have to improvise. Sometimes I have to, like, introduce on the spot an interesting NPC character who the players can interface with and sometimes go on adventures with if the need arises. And that's kind of why I like having just this big document just ready to go anytime. Just, I can just open it up. I can take a character at random, change 1 or 2 things on the fly, plug them into the game. My players think I've done all this awesome planning, and that I slave away writing for hours every week and all this painstaking. Nope, it's all smoke and mirrors. I don't work at all for D&D. It comes straight out of my butt 100% of the time. But I have this folder filled with little character concepts, and sometimes even though I haven't had major aspirations of, like, writing a fantasy novel. I wrote a novel in 2011 for NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writers Month. It's like a writing It's just like this writing workshop where the idea is, oh, you're trying to train yourself to get over writer's block by forcing yourself to write every single day. You're supposed to write X amount of words per day, and then by the end of the month, you have a 50,000 page novel. That's the goal. 50,000 pages in 1 month. So I did that in like 2010 or 2011. I wrote a full novel. I published it to my blog, and that exercise was like basically, I need to get this fantasy stuff out of my system because I'm not good at writing fantasy. That was my thought. And I haven't had like the impulse since, usually, because I've had D&D as a creative outlet instead. But once in a while, I would get a bug up my butt about it, and I would like go, I'd be, all right, I feel like writing something, and I know it's not going to go anywhere, so I'm just going to go into this folder where I've got all these D&D ideas. I'm going to pull one out. Oh, I did one right before lockdown, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. We did an adventure called Bicklebell House, which was like a Groundhog Day kind of thing, where they were stuck in this time loop. Do I want to go in here? I gotta go see Rosa. They're stuck in this time loop, and there's this like time-eating demon that is, there's like a murder mystery thing inside of this time loop. So it was a really fun adventure. And so yeah, I got a bug up my butt, and I was like, I feel like writing something. So I took that concept, that adventure, and was like, this would make a good like novella or something. And I started writing it. And then I burned out, because I always burn out. After a few weeks, I felt like I didn't want to do it anymore. And I'm like, you know what? That happened again. This end of last year. I was getting a little burned out on my YouTube content. I always forget what I have to... I don't think I've got to get her anything. I think we're going to get her 1 level and then keep going. So yeah, end of last year, I'm a little burned out on YouTube. I'm just jonesing for something else to work on. And we start this Weird Al project. But at the same time, I'm like, I kind of feel like I just want to write something. So I went back into the folder, and I found this druid that I had made years ago for Flump of the Wild that I had totally forgot about. And I'm like, this is such a bad concept for a fantasy novel. Like, I'm going to burn out on this immediately. I'm going to get 30 pages in and then get it out of my system. That didn't happen, though, this time. Like, I didn't reach a point where I wanted to stop writing, and so I just did, and I kept just refining it. And then by the time I'm like, okay, well, I'm this far in now, I should probably write an outline. Like, where is this going? So I outlined like a basic adventure and stuff to the primary characters and this like romance subplot, and the romance is the main plot, I think. Anyway. And yeah, the outline is like, okay, well, it's going to be split into so many acts, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write up to the end of the first act, and then I'm going to, if I get that far, I'm going to give it to some beta readers, get some other eyeballs on it. I went the wrong way, I think. I'm pretty sure. Get some other eyeballs on it, and just find out what I have. And by that point, I'll have like part of a book. Well, what I had was over 200 written pages when I got to the end of the first act. And I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I didn't like write the first act of a novel. I wrote like the first novel in a series. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's where I'm at. I got to that point, and I had never been to that point before. And I don't know if I'm proud of myself. It's a strange feeling getting that far to a place that I've never been before with a writing project. But like I said, I've got beta readers going through it now. And yeah, that's just kind of the process. Every few years, I feel like I got this, like, I'll take a swing at this. I'll try to write again and see if maybe this time it sticks. And it never does. And I was trying to think about like what changed, like what was different this time. I don't think it was because the idea is sound. The idea is ridiculous. The whole premise of this character going on adventures and being like the protagonist of a book is very silly and weird, and I'm not sure how good of a job I did making it serious, but I honestly think, here's the problem. Years and years ago, I wrote a series of little like fantasy short stories that I wanted to write. This would have been 2002, after that, 2003 or 4, around there. I was working at the Little Pea Clinic, and I think Rydia needs some healing. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to ever finish a novel, but I can, like, write some short stories, right? Like, I can do little fantasy short stories, 30 pages or so. We'll see where we go. The problem I kept running into at that time is I'd write, like, I'd be in the zone, and I was writing in a notebook at the time. I didn't have my laptop up at work yet. And I'd be in the zone writing, and I'd be in a good place. Then I'd hit a wall. And the wall was always basically the same. The wall was always, like, I need to do research. I need to know, like, what material this object is made out of. Or I need to know, like, how to make this plant foliage sound realistic. Or I need to look up, like, what a structure would look like or be laid out as. The writing advice that is often given when you get into a block like that is to just leave it blank. Like, write around it. What do I want to do? Thunder. Yeah, like, write around it and then come back. That's, like, the general advice that people will typically give. Like, if you get to a spot, you just don't know what to do, just leave it blank, come... I've never been able to do that. If I leave it blank, like, it just festers in my head, like, it just keeps... Until I do something about it, until I go... So what I would have to do is I would be in the zone writing, and I would get frustrated. And at the time, I don't have a computer up at work yet. So what I would have to do is, after work... I would drive to the library and do research. Like, I'd make a little list of the things that I wanted to look up. And this would get really, really frustrating sometimes, because I would research my little list of things, and then I'd come back the next day, and then I would write for like 20 minutes or whatever, and then I'd just get stuck on something else. And it was just really slow going. And I did finish a couple of little short stories. But it just was not satisfying to do long term, and I eventually stopped doing that. Now, I did eventually get a laptop and internet access at work, which made the process a little faster, because now I have Wikipedia, right? Like, I get stuck in a little thing, and instead of having to wait and go do research like in a book, like a caveman, just hop on Wikipedia. But even Wikipedia can make the process really slow, because if you're going to do research on Wikipedia, you still have to know like what you're looking for. You still have to kind of know the ballpark of what you need. And sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I didn't know what I needed. Sometimes, like, I couldn't get a satisfying result. And of course, there's also the trouble of just falling down the Wikipedia hole, right? Because I like doing research. I enjoy it. I like flipping through books and learning things. And so I'm going to give you an iron armlet, I think. You have one. Tella, I'm not giving anything. Tella can just stay naked, like my druid. Yeah, you fall down the Wikipedia hole, and it's fine. I do enjoy that, but it's not great when you're trying to actually write something. It always felt like I was shifting gears very abruptly, if that makes sense. Like, that was like no damage, Cecil. Come on, man. Like, if I'm writing, I'm in the zone and I'm fine. And if I'm researching, I'm in the zone and I'm fine. But if I have to keep switching back and forth, even if it's just switching tabs over from my word processor and over to Wikipedia and back, I kept finding myself just getting lost and getting distracted. And in general, writing on a computer with internet access is always very distracting. Like, I always want to keep clicking away from it. On the internet, what's Homestar Runner up to this week? You all know the drill, I'm sure. So that became a problem. Like, the research problem was better, but it never really got solved. This past year, though, this past couple months, I have a much better tool for research, because now I have ChatGPT, and you don't have to switch gears at all. You just be writing, and you hit something, and you need to do a spot of research, and like, it's right there, and you don't even have to switch gears. It just gives you the answer. And even if it's a wrong answer, for fantasy literature, that might be okay. Like, it's okay if the answer's a little bit wrong, and I can always go back and change it later when I'm in a different frame of mind. But for now, even though I'm still technically, like, leaving it blank, it doesn't feel like I'm leaving it blank. And that's just so I didn't get stuck with writer's block. I just stayed in the zone and kept going. And that's one of the reasons I think I just managed to write over 200 pages this time. I have AI. So robots wrote my book, really. I didn't do anything. I just sat there and pushed the buttons. I'm just the monkey man pushing the buttons over here, and the robots wrote the book. We've all seen that episode of South Park now. So yeah, that's what happened. I don't know anything about publishing or marketing a book. I don't know if I even want to go through the process of finding like a literary agent or anything like that. I actually don't think the book is very marketable, but I'm happy to have finally written one. Now, I actually don't like writing prose. That's the other problem I always run into, is actually writing out the prose, the descriptions of events and character dialogue and stuff. Sometimes that's fun, but what I really enjoy writing is the world building notes. That's my favorite part of writing fantasy literature. And sometimes reading fantasy literature, like sometimes browsing the Wikipedia page for, or the subreddit for your favorite fantasy series is like as rewarding as reading the books, right? That's kind of where we've been with A Song of Ice and Fire for the past decade. No new books are ever coming out, so all you really have is like community engagement, right? So that's kind of, and it's fun. But the world building parts are the parts that I really, really enjoy. And I end up with, my feeling is I need to be able to answer any reasonable question about this setting, about the world, and about the characters. Like, it doesn't all need to go into the story. That's too much of a thing. That's what, the subreddits and the fan wikis are for. Wikipedia and whatnot. But, like, I need to be able to answer reasonable questions about the setting, the world, the magic system, and what have you. I am going to save at this save point. I don't want to die on this boss. I'm not going to save over my endgame save. We're going to save right there. Yeah. So that's where I started with this concept. I wrote a little bit of like the first chapter, and then I just started doing world building stuff. Like, I would take a break from writing the prose in order to write part of the story and get to a part where I'm like, okay, well, I need to figure out how the world works in this aspect before I can write the next part. And then I would do that. So I ended up with a bunch of world building notes. And then what ends up happening is there's another trap. Writing is just a bunch of traps, you guys. But there's another trap where if you have a big bundle of world building notes as a storyteller, like, your impetus is to share all of it. Like, they're all cool ideas, right? Like, you want to share your cool ideas with your reader. You want them to like the setting and the characters as much as you do, but they can't if you don't give it to them. And so I would often fall into that trap in my prose, and I would put too much of the world building stuff in the story. And then when I went back to read the story to do revisions or do edits or proofreading and stuff, I would hate it. And I would keep like second guessing myself. Like, do I need to change this? Do I need to remove this? Do I need to add more detail? Is this too much detail? And I would agonize over it. How much does the reader actually need to know for this part? And am I going to have a better part in the story later to give this information again? Or is this information that even needs to be given to the player? I say player because a lot of my writing exercises over the years have been in like RPG Maker stuff. So probably the current biggest work of fiction of mine you might still find on the internet if you looked for it, other than the NaNoWriMo novel that I wrote like 12 years ago, would be my RPG Maker game. That's out there in the wilds if you are inclined to look for it. And yeah, it was always hard to get criticism for RPG Maker games. The RPG Maker communities weren't really set up to give good feedback. So the creative process could kind of get bogged down. But it was like always a balancing act. Like, how much of this do I really need to give to the... there it is. Like, how much of this do I really need to give to the player or to the reader or to the viewer if you're making movies, I guess. So for this story, I'm like, okay, I want to solve this problem in advance. If I do get burned out and not finish this, I don't want it to be because I've looked back at the story and hate what I've written. So what I decided to do was do like little like interleave in between each chapter, like just one page, allow myself one page of just world building notes that may or may not be connected to the story. I don't actually care if they're connected to the story or not. I just want like have one little page, have an outlet for me to just reveal something cool that I know about the setting that the reader and the characters might even not know. It's like this little fourth wall break in between chapters in a different color font. So that became the process. Like finish writing a chapter, and then I would get to write my little world building thing. And I think that combined with the relative ease of doing research, now that I don't like this fight at all. We're going to bail. Now that I have AI tools like ChatGPT to really, really speed up spot research. Like nothing in this world is ever going to be a replacement for just going to the library with a stack of books. Okay, like Radia's not going to be able to kill these. Like, then nothing's going to replace that. I'm still going to want to go up to the President Barack Obama library and just get a stack of books and, like, on a subject, like today I'm going to learn all about castle walls kind of stuff. ChatGPT's not good for that. ChatGPT is for, like, okay, characters walked into a room. What does this room look like? What is the desk made out of? What's on the desk? Like, it's good for that kind of stuff. I think I want fire here. I guess we'll find out. Oh, Rydia can't cast fire anyway. Here, have some ice. So, yeah, so I have these two outlets, and I have those little world-building notes. So I get to a point in a chapter where I'm like, I really want to share some world-building notes here. So now I have an outlet. Like, okay, I can just wait until the end of the chapter, and then I know what I'm going to do for my world-building notes now. And so having those two outlets really made it a lot easier to just stay in the zone writing. So that's good, right? That I managed to complete that. And as a little... Oh, I think it automatically equipped Kain when he left the party. I just noticed there's a spear in my inventory. So Kain is out there naked somewhere without his armor and without his spear. So, as just a little bonus for anybody who's just followed along with the video up to this point, thank you for listening, by the way, and thank you for being a viewer of the channel and for putting up with long hiatuses when I feel like I have to step away. In this case, it was because I had two other projects I was very interested to work on, but could not really be shared with YouTube, if that makes sense. The Weird Al project, thankfully, now is being shared with YouTube, so the content is coming, at least. But, yeah, it's just good to have those other projects to work on. And... did I come through this door? No. Yeah, this is the right way. So I want to walk you guys through just one of the world-building notes. Like, one of the aspects of world-building that I put... Let's switch to Tella first. That I put a lot of thought into... or I feel like I put a lot of thought into, because it's something that I really have strong opinions on in fantasy literature. So I'm like, if I'm going to write a fantasy book, I'm going to have it a certain way. What I really like about fantasy in particular, not all fantasy is like this, but enough fantasy. Like Lord of the Rings, for example, the example, really, is I actually like stories that have different fantasy races. I like having all different kinds of races in my books. I like having elves and dwarves and hobbitses and what have you. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. But what I like about when you write this aspect of fantasy well, there's a strong compulsion to view fantasy races as being like different cultures. Like the humans have their own culture, and then like the elves and dwarves each have their own culture. But you can explore culture in any form of writing. Like sci-fi is really good about this. One of my favorite sci-fi stories is the video game series Mass Effect. Mass Effect has lots of different sci-fi races. In fact, it falls into a little trap that I kind of like to call the one of everything problem, where, like, okay, we have, say, 6 or 8 or whatever different alien races in this setting, and so our, like, adventuring party, like our main cast, is going to have one of everything, and that's the party. That's how Mass Effect does. In Mass Effect, it's about humans predominantly. So you have like 3 humans in your party, and then you've got like one of the Quarians and one of like the blue ladies, and then one of the what are the Krogans? What's Garrus? Garrus is he a Taurian? Is that it? Taurian? I might have that wrong, but it's a one of everything story. The problem I have with sci-fi stories, though, when it comes to exploring like the interactions between like fantasy races, is when I think race, I think like biology, like what defines them biologically, what separates them, what makes these people different from each other, that they cannot bridge the divide with just like culture or language. And the answer in a sci-fi story is nothing at all. Whether you're looking at Star Trek or Star Wars or any story where like humans and aliens coexist in this federation, you always kind of run into the same problem where you don't really have a lot of different sci-fi races. What you really have is just a lot of funny looking humans. And Mass Effect does a better job of this than most, because there's a lot of little subplots about how like each of the alien species has kind of evolved on their own, and then how they made first contact with other like planet-faring species and kind of came into this federation of planets. But by the time you get to the game and you're building your party out of all the different characters that you meet, they're basically just all funny-looking humans. And like, to really drive this point home about, like, think about humanity. Like, I don't mean, like, humanity as a civilization or a culture. I mean, like, think about Homo sapiens as a species. What separates us from other species that might have been dominant on our planet? Well, there's a couple things. Like, we've got our big brains, but our big brains and our tool use and our intelligence is not what got us there. What got us there was our ability to walk upright, our ability to throw things with incredible accuracy. I need water. Speaking of hydrating, our ability to sweat and remove heat from our body to efficiently move over great distance. Like, those are the things that got humanity to the top of the food chain. And within a couple 100,000 years or whatever, like, our technology that we built has so far surpassed what our ancestors had to contend with that we don't even think of those 3 things, standing upright, throwing things accurately, or sweating, as being predominantly human. Like, they're part of our life, but we don't think of them as being like, this is what would set us apart from other types of intelligent species that might inhabit Earth. And that's the problem with sci-fi. It's not a problem. If you like sci-fi, that's great. And I like a lot of sci-fi too. But like watching Star Wars or Star Trek or playing Mass Effect or something, once you go far enough into a technological gap, it really drives home the point of like, you're really just looking at a lot of funny-looking humans when it comes down to it. Versus a fantasy setting where you don't have that same technological gap. Sometimes you have a magical gap that serves the same purpose. Like, if magic is really predominant in a world, like, it kind of doesn't matter. If everybody has access to the same magic, you kind of have the same problem that Mass Effect does with technology. And again, it's not necessarily a problem, it's just it's a personal taste of mine. What I really like in exploring fantasy literature are the stories where you don't have a gap like that. You have several different intelligent speaking races inhabiting the same planet, and like, their differences really matter. Like, what makes them different from one another can be part of the story, and it can be introduced into character conflict. It can drive plots, and it isn't necessarily cultural. A major element of Lord of the Rings, for example, are that the elves and dwarves and men, the men are what are called, that's what Tolkien called humans in Lord of the Rings. They're called men. Elves and dwarves and men inhabit this world, and they all have this common foe, but like, they just can't get it together. Like, they just can't like come together with their leaders and figure out like, what are we going to do about this? And the reason is partially cultural, because men and elves and dwarves in this world have very different cultures that just clash a lot. They don't see eye to eye on stuff. They don't even inhabit the same parts of the world. Like, they have their little enclaves. The elves live in the forests. The dwarves live underground in the mountains. The humans live in the flatlands and the plains where they build their cities. And overlap always tends toward conflict. But their cultures are informed by, in this case, not biology. It's informed by magic, because the creation myth of Middle Earth the idea is like there's this, like, God is singing a song, and it's the song of creation, and all of the different elements of creation have their own place in the song. So, like, God has created his angels, and one of his angels is Gandalf, spoiler warning, but then, like, he created the elves, and then one of his other angels wanted in on the creation and created dwarves, and then another one, the bad guy, wanted again, so he created orcs. So you've got orcs and elves and dwarves and ents and animals and eagles and all these other that are all part of this music of creation. They all have their own place. So it's very hard for, like, an elf to change their mindset, because they're part of this world. Their soul is plugged into it, kind of connected to it. And the dwarves are as well, and the ents are as well, in their own separate ways that keep them apart. And then God created men who are not plugged into anything. The idea in the cosmology of Lord of the Rings is that men are, like, special. Like, they have short lives, but then when they die, they don't... what is the lore here? Do they get recycled back into the planet like Lifestream in Final Fantasy? I don't really remember. It's been a long time since I've read through, like, Tolkien's letters and the Silmarillion and stuff. But the idea is that men, because they're not connected, they're not plugged into the world, they're the ones that can, like, go about and, like, move around and do things. They're the ones that can, like, field armies and, like, get things done that need to get done. And hobbits, by the way, in the cosmology of Lord of the Rings, are basically just little men. They're basically just small. They're like an offshoot of humans, is a good way to think of hobbits. And that's why all the main characters of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are... Where am I going? I'm going here. So I want to get my magic points back. That's why all the main characters are men and hobbits, basically. Other than, like, Gandalf is an angel. He was sent to help the quest. But I love the setting and the world building in Lord of the Rings, because it can explore a lot of these differences between these fantasy races. It's like, this is what might really be like if on our planet there were more than one, like, intelligent civilization building species, right? And you just don't get that a lot of times in sci-fi and in a lot of fantasy literature. So, for example, going the other direction, you have a story like Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV is like a kind of in-between thing. So we will eventually meet characters in this game who are not humans, but, like, all the major characters are humans. The only other, like, intelligent creatures we'll meet in the game, other than, it's like some monsters, I guess. Yeah, I guess the Eidolons count, the monsters, but... Or Eidolons. I forget how the voice acting in this game pronounces it. But, yeah, you eventually go down and you meet dwarves. And they're dwarves, they all live underground. And you do kind of get the sense in this game that, like, oh, dwarves are very different from humans. Like, they have different thought processes, they have different... But when you do a couple adventures for, like, the Dwarven Kingdom, you kind of find out, nah, not really. They're just kind of funny-shaped humans. Like, there's not really... You're just dead, Edward. My goodness. Thanks for that. But it's also not really... Final Fantasy IV is also not really trying to explore these ideas of having multiple fantasy races. Most of the Final Fantasy series doesn't. And then when you go to the far other extreme, you have the Mass Effect problem writ large. Like, modern Dungeons & Dragons is really leaning towards this idea that there aren't major differences between all the different fantasy races. And the reason they do this is because you really don't want to tell players what they can't do. Like, I totally understand why they're moving far away from this idea that, like, oh, elves and dwarves are fundamentally different, and here are the rules that you need at the table to explore those differences in a story. They're getting away from that to the point where one of the books, and probably in their next, when they're going to put out a revised player's handbook, I think in the next year or two. I think I read 2024 they're going to do that. One of the books actually has rules for you don't use fantasy races at all. Just like let your players pick from this list and then change their ability scores like this and then just describe what they look like. And I think that's great. I think you could tell a lot of awesome stories that way because it takes a lot of the pressure away from players, especially in D&D, to like, oh, I got to learn all about this like this like fantasy species that I am and like their culture. No, you just have to know about your character and you're good to go. So I understand like that it makes, but for me, like having a story that is just all funny shaped humans, it kind of like, why not just have humans then? Sticking in the realm of just Final Fantasy, one of the games does that. Final Fantasy IX has all these different like weird shaped people, but they're all humans. Like I think they're even just referred to as humans. But you have like people that are shaped like animals, and you have people that are like weird colors, and like you've got Amaranth. He's like a blue man with his crazy rope hair. He's not another kind of thing. He's just like a dude. Your main character in the game is Zidane. Zidane has his silly monkey tail, and like nobody blinks an eye at it. He's like, oh yeah, no, Zidane's just the human man with a monkey tail. Why not? I'm pretty sure Steiner is just made of metal. He's just a metal man. So, and that's kind of the end point. Like, if you want to have a lot of different kinds of people, but you don't want to explore the idea of what would it actually be like if there were all these kind of different people in the world, you can go to that extreme. I've spent a lot of time in that space, especially running D&D, as much as I have, but Edward's gone. Oh, he runs away when he gets low on hit points. I remember now. Good. Great and good. He can stay gone as far as I'm concerned. And I've run D&D campaigns like that. And I like D&D campaigns like that. But I don't want every D&D campaign to be like that. So, and even if I were to run a campaign like that, which I've done, which I've gone and said like, okay, so in this campaign, like, you have to pick one of these few races, and they're very, very different, and they see each other differently. And we're going to be exploring that as part of the story. So, like, if you roll up a gnome in this game, be prepared for, like, these stereotypes to come at you. Be prepared for, like, these expectations. Regardless of what your actual character is, like, people are going to have ideas about what you are and what you can do and what you're liable to act like or to say because they can see you're a gnome. Because most gnomes, their brains are wired a certain way. Even in that situation, though, for D&D especially, you still want to have the freedom to, like, if a character just doesn't want to play the standard... Standard's the wrong word, because even within those constraints, you've got a million different kinds of characters to play. But say you want to make a gnome that doesn't act like a gnome at all, like, doesn't see himself as a gnome, doesn't want to... Like, that's also a very interesting story you can tell. And I think, in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, and in terms of protagonists in any fantasy literature... There's going to be some elements of that. This character is not your standard gnome or your standard elf or your standard dwarf, because if they were, they would be hanging out in Elf Town with all of the other elves doing elfy things in their elfy woods with their little elfy harps. And because this character is not, because this character has decided to go on an adventure with his dwarf friend and his tiefling friend, like, there's something up with him. Like, there's something different about this character. That's like an element of Dungeons and Dragons that I really, really like. And I think to really get to that, though, you have to be willing to say on some level, you know what? It's okay to have elves and dwarves and humans that are fundamentally different from each other, to have a baseline that they then built their culture off of. Their biology is different. They might not even be able to, like, mate with each other. What happens if an elf and a dwarf roll around in bed? The answer is a dwelf. I have been informed. Dwelf is a thing in some of the older editions of D&D. Apparently there are half elves, half dwarves, and they're called dwelfs. So, in my mind, I have kind of like a platonic ideal for what the best balance is between, can we have fantasy races that can be explored as different people that aren't just all funny-looking humans, versus can we still have some element of, like, if you were running an RPG based in like Lord of the Rings, it really would make no sense for the elf and the human and the dwarf to go on an adventure together for like 90% of the storyline, except for Legolas and Gimli. Now, I'm not going to talk about Legolas because elves are dumb and Legolas is dumb. Gimli's my favorite character in Lord of the Rings, and he's kind of like the platonic ideal of what I'm talking about, because in universe, Gimli is like the dwarfiest dwarf who ever dwarfed. He's got a big beard, he carries a battle axe, he loves killing orcs, he likes making fun of elves, he likes talking about rocks and mines. He has this like strong sense of loyalty and duty to his companions. Like he will swear a blood oath and then like follow, like he's the dwarfiest dwarf just in general. But in the story, over the course, and very quickly in the story, actually, as early as like coming out of Moria and going into Lothlorien, Gimli. My inventory is a mess, by the way. Like Gimli is making friends with Legolas, right? Who's an elf, and he respects and admires the beauty and the power of Galadriel, who's one of the most powerful elves in Middle-earth, and he declares her to be the most beautiful thing in Middle-earth, and he goes off on adventures in very non-dwarfy places, in very non-dwarfy ways, and so by the end of Lord of the Rings, actually I think canonically Gimli gets to go to Valinor at the end. I think he's the only dwarf that is afforded the honor of sailing west at the very, very end of his life. Not at the end of the books. He lives a long life after that. He and Legolas actually go off on adventures, he and his elf pal, for years and years and years. And he goes to like, Legolas shows him all the enchanted forests of Middle-earth, and Gimli takes his elf buddy down to like glittering caves. And like, they're hetero life partners, and it's really sweet. But what's really special about Gimli, and this applies to Legolas too, I guess, is that like if you were to ask any character in the books, like, is Gimli a dwarf? They would all say, of course he's a dwarf. He's the dwarfiest dwarf who ever dwarfed. He's got the beard. He's got like a helmet, like a dwarf helmet. He's got like a bad Scottish accent. Like, yeah, super dwarf, no question. But I think by the end of the story, when Gimli has changed, when he's gone through all of his adventures, when he's seen the beauties of the world outside of the caves and the mines that he's used to, at the end of it, if you were to ask other dwarves, is Gimli a dwarf? They'd probably be like, kind of weird for a dwarf. You know, he's got like weird ideas about the world. Yeah, not much of a dwarf, I would say. That's the sweet spot. That's what adventuring should do to anyone. Humans, too. Like, humans typically aren't defined in that way in fantasy literature a lot of times. In Lord of the Rings, they kind of are, but a lot of times they're not. But I'm just going to summon Chocobo over and over. Oh, and use Darkness, I guess. But like, even human adventurers like should be very different from other humans that they meet. Like, they like, other humans should think they're a little strange, which does happen with the hobbitses in Lord of the Rings. Hobbits that go on adventures are considered to be very un-hobbit-like, which is just a cool little tidbit. So in modern fantasy, though, like in terms of video games, you can just go, I guess. In terms of video games, I have another character. Like, Gimli is my number one example. Like, this is my platonic ideal for like what a character who is like a made-up fantasy race should be in a game that has, or a story, or a book, or whatever, that has a lot of fantasy races in it. Like, Gimli's the platonic ideal, right? The other character that I always think about, because it's a very different kind of story, is, we talked a little bit about FF4 and the fantasy races here, and then we talked a little bit about FF9 and the fantasy races there. Well, the best Final Fantasy game for fantasy races is, without question, Final Fantasy XII. When you go to Ivalice, and Ivalice is a place that has 5 predominant fantasy races that are all very, very different from each other. Not just in terms of like what they look like, but also in terms of how they're likely to act, where they're likely to live, what they're likely to be interested in. Like, you really get the sense that each of these groups of people have little enclaves in the world all to themselves. And it doesn't fall into this one of everything trap. Like you think, oh, there's 5 different fantasy races. You have 6 party slots. They're going to give you 1 of each and 2 humans. Like it doesn't. Not only are most of the characters in your party in that game humans, most of them are blonde, fair-skinned humans that come from a particular part of the world, because that's where the story takes place. And it makes for a really strong story. Now, the one non-human character that joins your party is Fran. Fran is a bunny girl. She's a Viera from an all-female race. They're basically elves. They live in the woods. They play music. They're silly, bunny-eared women in, like, metal bikinis. Fran wears a metal bikini. Don't ask me why. And there are other fantasy races. There's the Banga. There's the Numao. Actually, there's only like 2 or 3 Numao in the game. You get the sense that they're either very rare or they just don't like people much. Where am I going? I thought you could see the passages on the minimap. I guess not. There is a passage somewhere, I think. Unless it's been removed in the pixel. I don't know. I'm not going to worry about it. You've got... What else do you have? The humans, of course, and then the Moogles. You can play Moogles in this game. Or you can play Moogles in some Ivalice games, not in 12. But in Final Fantasy 12, it's like, okay, the story is about this small human country situated around the town of Rabanastre. And so the protagonists of the story, the characters most affected by the inciting incident, are going to be Dalmascans. They're going to be from this part of the world. So they're going to be people who live in this desert kingdom, and characters in this desert kingdom have blonde hair and fair skin. So they all look like each other. There's 4 characters that fit that description. And then you get Balthier, who's another human character, but he's from the Empire, so he looks a little different from the others. And then you have Fran, who's the Viera. She's the scantily clad bunny girl. So what the trick that this game pulls off is going through the game, you meet characters who are Banga, and you meet characters who are Moogles, and you very, very rarely meet Viera or Numao, because these are the ones that they're rarer. They don't dwell with humans. They don't live in the human cities. You don't cross paths with them because the places you're going tend to not be peopled by them. And this lends a really cool air of just mystique to how these fantasy races are different. For example, Moogles are absolutely everywhere. Moogles have integrated with human society. There probably are little Moogle villages out there, but they also really just enjoy living and working amongst humans. So you see them all over the place. And then the Banga are this kind of like lizard people. And they're less common than Moogles, but there are a couple key characters. You've got Miguelo, who's like a merchant guy you run quests for in the beginning. And then later you meet Bagamnon, who is Balthier's rival, like a mercenary guy that chases you around. So they're these kind of scary looking reptilian people with like these big fanged mouths. But you never get one in your party. You never go to like the Banga village where they all live. There's no storyline where like you follow. They're just a part of the world. They're just the ones that you encounter are the ones who have integrated into Rabanastre and its surrounding areas. So it feels like there's a really robust set of cultures here to explore, founded on the idea of these are very, very different kinds of species. Like there's something about Moogles that drives them to want to be like useful, like want to be engineers or map makers or cartographers, that is a map maker, Brick Road, or like carpenters. They like to build things, like to fix things. They like to be of service to human culture for whatever reason. That's an interesting idea. It's an interesting concept you can play with. There's the stories you can tell. Final Fantasy XII doesn't go that far into exploring like Moogle culture or anything, and it doesn't have to. All it has to do is like have the smoke and mirrors. Like you can just imagine that it's there. But then with Fran, the Viera, because at one point in the story, because probably the Viera is the one that joins your party, you do go to the Viera village. At some point in your adventure, you realize that like other Viera are tangled up in this mess, and you have to go there And when you do visit there, it's like Fran, just like Gimli, feels out of place. She's a Viera in a world filled with humans. Like, you know, she's getting funny looks. She doesn't fit in anywhere. She talks differently than the other people in your party. She has different reactions to magic when it happens around her. You never get a sense for what her priorities are because she doesn't tell you, because it's none of your goddamn business. That's why. But I want this. This is what I want. Yeah. You can keep arrows. That's fine, Ms. Rosa. But then when you go to the Viera village, like, there's a very strong sense of like, well, Fran doesn't belong there either. Like, she's not a human for sure, but she's definitely not a Viera anymore. Like, I think they explicitly like say like she doesn't belong in the woods anymore. And when they and it's not just like, you know, she decided to leave in person. It's like you feel something spiritual there. Like, something is broken, like she ruined something, or she made a decision and now can't go. Like, it's something very strong that keeps her from returning. And like, she's made this decision and she's like she's okay with it. She's in a good place with it. But you have that same dynamic. If you were to ask anyone in the world, like, is Fran a Viera? Does she like belong out here with humans? You'd be like, no, like, yeah, sure, definitely. Like, she has bunny ears. She's wearing the metal bikini. We don't know why she's wearing the metal bikini. Definitely a Viera, no question. But then if you go to her village and like, is Fran a Viera? Does she belong here? Like, no, she's trapped between two worlds. Really cool dynamic. And the story doesn't need to explore it. Again, it's kind of just smoke and mirrors. You just get the sense that a lot of this could be much deeper than it actually is. And that's the sweet spot, that Gimli and Fran sweet spot, which is kind of a gross sentence. I grant you. I should not have said it exactly like that. But like, I wanted to get to there with this novel that I wrote. So I put a lot of work into this part. Which is why I'm sharing it with you here. And it's not going to get shared in the world building notes in the actual book because it's too long and it doesn't make any sense outside of this context anyway. I just don't care about fighting skeletons. I'm sorry. I just cannot be arsed to fight a skeleton right now, let alone 4 of them. So, okay. I want to hit that Ivalice sweet spot. That was really where I wanted to go. So I can't have like a million fantasy races. I can't just have like, you know, the hippo people and the tree people. And like, I've got to be reserved. I have to have some small number. And I decided on 4 or 5. Either 4 or 5, depending on how you're counting, I guess. I have put a lot of thought into this, I swear. So, okay. The first one is humans. That's easy enough. I don't want to write a fantasy story without humans because I don't really have a good answer to that question. I guess there's no reason I couldn't. It's like, I'm a human and I understand human like physiology and culture, and like I understand like how to write stories with humans and what humans are a good baseline. Put it that way. And then for number 2, I have this druid character who I was going to introduce, and she's already a satyr. So she's like, that's the second fantasy race I want to use is satyrs. So you have satyrs in the story. So satyr is a half person, like half human, half goat, by the way. And so that's number 2. But then I had a big problem. I thought I had a big problem because satyrs, to me, in Dungeons and Dragons, they are an actual fantasy race that you can play. I think Mystic Odysseys of Theros has rules and stats for if you want to play a satyr character, you can. I don't know if you can, just attack, whatever. And you cure. That's what we'll do. So, but satyrs, when you think about it, because they have such a strong tie to real-world mythology, that's a problem. Like, elves and dwarves don't really have that problem. Because those are just Tolkien races. Like, Tolkien gave us the gift of elves and dwarves. Everybody knows what an elf is. Everybody knows what a dwarf is. Probably not a lot of people know what a dwelf is, unless they've watched this video. Or gone trolling through old D&D forums or something. But Like, Satyr brings to mind a lot of mythological connection that I wasn't comfortable with, in the sense that they don't feel like a species of people that would have culture unto themselves. They feel like trickster spirits that inhabit the woods, right? Like in Greek mythology, I'm not up on my Greek mythology, guys. I'm sorry. I could have done some research, but I didn't. But, like, it's not like the humans live here in Athens and then over across the Aegean is, like, the satyr village where all the satyrs... That's not how it works. Right? So I wanted to, like, erase some of those connotations. So I made some changes to what satyrs were and what they looked like and what they're called. They're not called that in the book. So you just kind of signal that, like, this is Brickroad's version of this fantasy species. Like, don't assume you know everything about satyrs because that's just what this happens to be. Like, we're calling it something different. We've described it as something different. It's something different. I'm going to double heal here. That's a good idea. So I have humans and I've got satyrs. And so now I'm in the Final Fantasy IV predicament. Or, like, Final Fantasy IV has humans and dwarves and that's it, right? And I didn't want to just have two. I didn't want to just have a world with two species. That is... I wanted to explore a little more than that. The story I want to tell only needs those two. The two main characters are a human and a satyr. So, like, that's enough, right? I could be done. I actually should be using darkness here, I think. So, pull these guys back a little faster. But I didn't want to just have the two. So I'm like, okay, what's a third one? Should I invent one? No, because the problem there is, like, if I'm inventing new species, I think the trap you can fall into sometimes is, like, how many species are there then? Because if you have a fantasy setting where they just invented all of their, like, from whole cloth, there's, like, nothing really recognizable from, like, the Tolkien mythos or pulling from real world mythology, it can start to feel like, oh, so this world just has a bunch of, like, weird alien critters. Ivalice kind of feels that way a little bit. In fact, the first Ivalice game that had humans and Viera and whatnot was a Game Boy Advance game. It was one of the Final Fantasy Tactics sequels, and it really felt like that. It really had the one of everything problem where there wasn't a lot of cohesion. A lot of thought put into the cohesion of the characters. Like, can we make these people feel like real people? It kind of felt like there could have been 30 other races. Like, oh, we've got, you know, the lizard people and the bunny people and, like, the weird blue sleepy guys and the Moogles. And, like, they could all just be... There could be 100 more. I didn't want it to feel that way. I wanted it to feel like Final Fantasy XII pulls off the idea that there's really only 5 kinds of people that live in this world. That's what I was aiming for. So, my third fantasy race that I went with are just dwarves. I mentioned dwarves are my favorite, and everybody knows what a dwarf is. I don't have to explain what dwarves are, and I don't have to give any signals like these dwarves are different, because they're not. Everything you know about fantasy dwarves is applicable, and I feel like, and I might be off base, but I feel like if you do that in a fantasy story, it really, like, it helps to signal, like, you're in kind of known territory. Like, you're not way off base, you're not way off the mark, you're not putting a lot of ink down that doesn't need to go down, if that makes sense. And I thought by having dwarves hanging out in the fantasy world could be, like, something familiar for people to kind of cling on to. So there's lots of dwarves. But I also did want the element in Ivalice in Final Fantasy XII where you have these Banga that are just in the world. You never go to the Banga village. There's one or two important Banga characters in the plot. I need to buy all new equipment, don't I? Can I? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we buy. Good. So yeah, because what works for me with the Banga in Final Fantasy XII is it gives the sense that you have this particular race of people who are very, very different from humans, but who just happen to not intersect with this plot, this current story we're telling about Dalmasca. Like, some Banga live in Dalmasca, and some Banga are Rabanasтрins, and you could have a Banga character in this plot. Maybe if they weren't so rare around here, you could envision having one in your party. There just happens to not be. But it lends a little exoticism to the game world that adds some texture that I think would really be lacking if it was just humans and you're one Viera, and also there's a Moogle on your airship. Like, Bonga is what really ties the world together. So when I thought about that for this story that I'm writing, I'm like, I'm just going to steal Bonga. Like, I'm just going to have Bonga in the story. So that's what I did. I stole Bonga wholesale. Barely changed them at all. I don't call them Bonga, but I call them something very similar to Bonga. Because, like, yeah, I'm just stealing the idea, but also, like, I want the reference to come through. Like, people who read the story that are familiar with the inspiration for this particular fantasy race that I'm including in the world for the same reason. Like, I want people to be able to, like, get the wink. And there are no Bonga characters that are major to the story. They don't feature strongly in the plot at all. They're just a small part of the world, just to add that little bit of texture. And then there's a fifth one that I don't feel like talking about. So that's the end of that story. So that's the kind of world building that I get into. That's the kind of rabbit hole that I will allow myself to fall down. Like, I spent so long on this question of what lives in this world alongside humans. Like, what sorts of people are there and how are they different? And once I had that list of, okay, we've got humans, we've got satyrs, we've got dwarves, we've got Bonga. Once I had that, it's like, now I've got a really good idea of, like, what a cosmopolitan human city would look like where all of these other peoples have moved in. Like, you'd have a dwarven enclave. This is how, like, what satyrs bring to the table. Like, they're not going to build human cities, but what do they do once they're there? Why aren't there many Bonga in this part of the world? Well, in the story, it's because it takes place in, like, a very temperate climate, and they're reptilian creatures. They much prefer to live in tropical climates. So, like, in the world building, like, there are more Bonga in the world, probably. Nobody knows for sure. There hasn't been an accurate census, but probably Bonga outnumber humans in the world if you were to have a big war or something. But they live in a much different part of the world predominantly than where the plot takes place. So only a few background characters. That's exactly the sweet spot that I was hoping to get into. I don't know if I succeeded or not. That's the problem with finishing the first draft of a fantasy book and just now having the first, like, beta readers put their eyeballs on it. Like, I have no idea if what I've written is good. I think that it's better than anything any swing I've taken at the tee before, specifically because I didn't allow myself to really get bogged down in a bunch of really stupid world building snafus. So yeah, that was it. Gave myself that one world building outlet, the little interleaves between chapters, which break the fourth wall a little bit, and having access to AI tools. Not to alleviate writer's block, like, not to solve the problem permanently, but just to get through the momentary wall of, I need to know what this table is made of, or what kind of birds would live here. I need to know, like, if somebody gets a tooth kicked out of their head, like, what could they do? Like, did people in medieval times replace their teeth? What did that look like? How did they keep it in place? What did they make it out of? Like, these are all questions. The tooth thing, I didn't have to look. It's not a story about dentistry. I don't know why my example went there, but yeah, just having a tool immediately to get through that block right now without having to shift gears away from being in that just writing zone, just being in that creative flow, has been so helpful. I've used it for D&D too. I've used ChatGPT to design an encounter where the players went into a room and there's a goblin who like welcomed them into the room, and now they're on the goblin's game show, and it's a rigged game show. And the players get to pick, like, their Jeopardy category. And then I can go on to ChatGPT and be like, generate trivia questions for this category. And it just gives me BS questions that I can lob at them. Had a whole encounter. Players had a blast with it. Lots of fun. So, that's where I'm at right now. And I think I'm about done playing. I wasn't going to complete Final Fantasy IV. I'm sorry if you looked at the video length and thought I would complete all of Final Fantasy IV. No, I just wanted to give you guys an update on why uploads have been very slow the past couple of months. It's because I have those 2 projects that I was putting all of my time into, writing this book and then working on the Weird Al tier list podcast videos along with my good chums, Dan and Not a Buttface. 2 of those episodes you can go watch right now. There's a playlist. I'll link the playlist down in the doobly-doo down there if you want to go check it out. And thanks so much for watching, guys, and I hope someday I will be able to share this book with you. Golbez is a jerk.